My neighbours recently decided to knock down their chimney. It was a massive job. They were doing it from top to bottom, and they were doing it on their own. What they found was that they needed to keep on upgrading their tools in order to do the job. Sledgehammers weren't enough. The SDS drill that they had, it was okay to start with, but then it was barely scratching the surface. So was the more powerful one that they hired. It reached its limit. Eventually they borrowed a breaker, the kind that you use on concrete floors. The harder the job, the greater the power required. An impossible job requires infinite power. We have no power to sort ourselves out, and so we need power from outside ourselves, power that is greater than any one of us, power that is greater than the collective efforts of humanity. Supernatural power of that kind can only come from an infinitely powerful God. Now, Paul wrote this: "I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes." Why is the gospel the power of God? Well, it's because our salvation is absolutely impossible for us, and so it has to come from God. It is impossible for us to put ourselves in the right with God. It is impossible for us to ensure that we always do what is right and to make amends for any of our wrongdoing. It is impossible for us to give ourselves life that is forever. We cannot do it on our own. We cannot do it as humanity collectively. Think about how powerless we are to sort out our own problems. Think about the recent awareness that has been raised about women being fearful to walk the streets at night. It's so wrong that most women have had to endure harassment of one kind or another from men. We've been doing this humanity thing for a very long time now, and we just can't seem to get it right. We shouldn't even need a government to step in and do something on an issue like this. And even if they do, and even if they're actually able to do something about this big issue, there will only be other big issues down the line. The infinite power of God that we need to fix us is in the gospel. That his own son was able to endure the hell of all humanity for all who would believe in him, so that we could be set free from our sinfulness. And that takes some power to endure that. Not only that, but the infinite power of God raised Jesus from the dead so that we could live in a new life, sharing in that new life even now and anticipating our own resurrection when he returns. That's the kind of power that kickstarts the Christian life. It might be something that you've never experienced before for yourself. And if you come to accept that Jesus died and rose again for your sin so that you could be made new in him, then you will know that power for yourself. This power that gives you a relationship with an eternal God so that you can call him Father, Dad. If you want that power, accept it. Accept that Jesus loved you and gave his life for you. Do it today. And once we have come to experience that power in his love, the Christian should be so overwhelmed and empowered by his power that they want to tell everyone. Now, we all have different ways of doing this, and the way that we might go about doing this might be very different to Paul and Barnabas as they travelled around from city to city, taking great risks, speaking in front of huge crowds. The true Christian, though, in one way or another, they will seek to bring that good news to as many people as they can by God's power. And that's what we're going to be exploring today. So first, let's see how we can show God's power. Now, we'll be brief on this because we were covering a similar kind of point last week. And if you missed that, you can always catch up on YouTube. It's always worth doing that for any sermon that you missed. But Paul and Barnabas were now in Lystra. They had escaped a death threat in the previous city. And whilst they were talking about Jesus here in Lystra, presumably in the public square, there's a man sitting there. And this man was unable to walk. He had never walked. Presumably he was there begging. But now he was listening to what Paul and Barnabas were teaching. Paul must have been given some sort of insight by the Holy Spirit as to this man's spiritual condition, because he sees that this man has faith, that he's listening and engaging with the message of Jesus, and that he has faith enough to be healed. So Paul speaks to him and tells him to stand up and walk. And this man who has never walked before, he does just that. It's that simple. Immediately the man is healed, instantaneously and completely healed. God's power should be shown through his people. And as I mentioned last week, I believe sometimes God may choose to operate through miracles, even like this today. We can certainly pray that he would. And if we have been enabled by God, by his Spirit who lives within us, to see that there is an opportunity to heal, then we certainly should take that, even if it means for us stepping out in faith as well. However, this isn't something that happens all too frequently. I've never seen a miracle on this kind of level. Even churches that are more keenly pursuing miracles than we are, they don't see this kind of thing happening all the time. But that doesn't mean that we don't show God's power in other ways. Isn't God's power shown in a believer who has a chronic condition, but who doesn't get bitter and grumpy, but is gracious and patient? Don't we see God's power at work when someone becomes a Christian from a lifestyle of addiction and abuse, and yet they're enabled to leave it all behind, even if there is some struggle in that, and they follow the way of Christ? God's power is shown in a couple being faithful to each other for 40 years, in a teenager who resists the various temptations that are on offer at that age, in the employee who acts with integrity, even if it means forgoing opportunities for promotion, and in the employer who cares for his workforce in a loving way. We show God's power in our lives every day, often in very simple ways. And these ways, they will be seen by the world. They may not provoke the same kind of amazement as a miracle would, but they still show that God is powerful and at work in a very real way in our lives. Sometimes, though, even these small things that we do, that will provoke some kind of amazement, or at least inquiry with those who see it, just like it does here. And in that we see the need for us to explain God's power. A few years ago, a man called Guy Gomer walked into the BBC studio in London. He was being interviewed for a new job. He was sat down, and for some reason they decided to put a microphone on him. That same day, BBC News were planning on interviewing a man called Guy Cuny, an internet expert, for an on-air interview about some legal dispute with Apple and some record label. But the BBC staff mistook Guy Gomer for Guy Cuny, and the poor man only realised he wasn't there merely for a job interview when the cameras were already rolling and he was being asked questions about the future of digital music live on television. You can actually see in the video the moment he realises that he's now being interviewed on live TV. Amazingly, he went along with it. He did his best to blag his way through the interview, though he was not offered the job at the end of it. Mistaken identity often happens, doesn't it? And perhaps it's happened to you. Probably not quite as drastically as with Guy Gomer, and probably not in the way that happened to Paul and Barnabas. They get mistaken for Greek gods. In one sense, you can't blame the town for getting it wrong. They've just witnessed this incredible display of divine power. And what's more, there were local legends going around of another nearby town where there were two gods that appeared in that town in human form. But no one recognised them, no one honoured them, and so the town endured the wrath of the gods. And so the city of Lystra, they go all out in paying homage to the two people that they assume to be Zeus and Hermes. They call for the temple priest and they begin a procession. They bring wreaths and bulls. They're about to offer a sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas. And into all of this chaos jump these two supposed gods tearing their clothes. With the town prattling on in their local language, tearing their clothes would give an immediate visual clue as to what the pair of them actually think about this kerfuffle. Tearing your clothes in that culture was a universal sign of anguish or sorrow or humiliation. And then they speak, and it's worth seeing carefully what they say. So look at the first point of their sermon in verse 15. Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. So the first thing they say is that they're only human, like the people who are there. They're not Greek gods. But then they quickly get on to why they are there and what they are doing, that they're here with a message of good news for the people. Now, in previous encounters in Acts, we've heard them speaking to Jewish audiences, and therefore they explain from the Bible how Jesus is the fulfillment of all their hopes. But now they are talking to a non-Jewish audience. And so instead of going to the Old Testament scriptures and the anticipation of a Messiah, they start with very basic concepts of God. And so the first thing they say properly, their first main point, is that God has made everything. He who is the one true living God. And therefore that to worship anything other than him is a useless thing to do. Their idol worship of Greek gods was not worship of the true God and therefore was useless. Now, in the modern day Midlands equivalent of Lystra, known as Leicester, which is where I'm from, you're much more likely to encounter people who worship multiple deities in their world religions. We're less likely to come across it in Cwmbran, but idol worship is no less common here than it is in Leicester or than it was even in first century Lystra. Our idols are just much more subtle. People, human beings, we're made to worship. And when people don't worship the true God, they simply worship other things in his place. So they worship money or children, jobs and success. We have idols that are our pets, our possessions, our lifestyles, our hobbies. Anything we treat as of greatest value in our lives, anything that we're willing to sacrifice something for, that can be an idol to us. Anything that is the source of greatest hope, value, or security, when it's not God, that's an idol. And when we think of it in that way, we see that idol worship is just as prevalent today as it was 2,000 years ago. People today, just as much as then, they need to be alerted to the fact that they are worshipping useless things and that there is one true God, the Creator God, who alone deserves our worship. Now, that's a very basic starting point for sharing the good news with them. If they worship many other things, well, what need have they for God? If they are already worshippers, why would they worship this other God? If their lives are so full of material deities, what space is there for God? But if people will see the uselessness of holding these things as of ultimate worth, then they will see the need for the one who is ultimately worthy. Well, the second point of Paul and Barnabas is in verse 16. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. So this point is that God has been patient with people. He is a kind and generous God. He doesn't immediately punish people for their foolishness and sin, but is loving and compassionate in giving them time to turn to him. How much do people need to know not only that there is one true God who is far more worthy of their worship than idols, but that he loves them and that he longs for them to turn to him, that he's being patient with people. That is worth sharing with our family and friends. And then their third point in verse 17. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. So God has shown himself. He has not left himself without any credible witness of who he is. He is the God who gives rain in order to grow crops and provide food for people. Now, we may have heard of Zeus as the god of thunder, but his role was much more expansive than that. He was the god of the sky. He was the god who gave rain to humans. So Paul's point is not just that God is the one that gives rain, but Zeus is not the one that you need to look to. Instead, look to the true God who does give you rain from heaven to provide you with crops. Even more than that, Hermes was a god he was like a messenger of the gods. So he brought the message of the gods. And here Paul and Barnabas are saying that God has given us his testimony. He has given us his message. He cares for the world. He provides all that we need. And that is the way that he brings his message, that he is there. So the point is this: God, as the one true supreme God, he alone should be worshipped. And he who has been patient in his immense love, he has given every human an opportunity to see something of him in this world. We see his immense power in the world that he has made as it reflects him. Paul says elsewhere in Romans chapter 1, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, they have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. No person can say that they've never had an opportunity to know something of who God is. He has provided this world, and it gives to us all. It gives all that we need. And as we try and connect with people, that might be a starting point for us with people. Look at the world around you. See how amazing it is. There is a God who has shown us something of himself. Well, the third thing for us, and we'll be very brief with this, is that we need to persist by God's power. The Jews from the previous towns, they turn up, they stir things up, they get the crowds on their side and they lob stones at Paul. They probably knock him out and drag him outside the city thinking he was dead. But in verse 20, the disciples, they gather around him. Presumably they're praying for him. Presumably they're praying that he would be healed. And Paul gets up. They actually go back into the city. They don't stick around long this time. They stick around for one more day and then leave for Derbe to share the gospel there. The point here is that it would be very easy for them to give up. You know, after you've been knocked out and left for dead, had stones thrown at you, it'd be easy to give up. But Paul carries on. He knows God's power, perhaps to heal him, certainly to strengthen him, and certainly to keep him going, persisting even though it's tough. Now, chances are we're not going to face anything of this kind, opposition like Paul faced. Even without human opposition, though, we have a spiritual enemy, the devil, who will make it tough going. And at times we will face human opposition. It is hard going sometimes, keeping on sharing the good news of Jesus. One way or another, it will be hard. But by God's empowering, we can keep on going, even when it's tough, as we rely upon him and his power. And the good news is, a church was formed in Lystra. Whether it's by their preaching on that occasion, whether it's the return journey that they made, maybe it's nearby believers who shared the gospel with them, but one way or another, God brought people in Lystra to know his power for themselves. Well, may God help us too, as we seek to show God's power at work in our lives in various ways, as we get opportunities to speak and explain just who God is and what it is to know him. And as we keep on persisting and sharing the good news and knowing his empowering, even to keep us through tough times. Well, Well, let's sing once more, then we'll come to a close.